All right, guys, welcome back to the last video of this chapter. Hopefully you had a chance to check out this kind of in-between section with the Axis blenders talking about the Battle of Britain and how Hitler had really underestimated the spirit of the British people and their determined effort to really resist the Nazis. That section also talked about the invasion of Russia and how Hitler made a pretty big mistake. You would think he would have learned from previous events of history to not attack Russia in the middle of winter. But anyhow, if you remember, Hitler and Stalin had signed this non-aggression pact back in 39, but Hitler basically decides, you know what, let's just throw that out the window, and he goes and attacks Russia to, again, get more Lebensraum, more living room, and got to stretch out the arms there so people have room to live. And he goes after Russia, but he's not super successful in all of that. The section also spends quite a bit of time talking about the Holocaust and what happens there to 6 million Jews and just the concentration camps and the horrific things that people went through. Some survived to tell the story, and so many others did not. So very sad period in history. That section also talked about Pearl Harbor and what happened on December 7th, 1941. The greatest generation rose to the challenge, and the United States officially joined World War II at that point. FDR, our president at the time, gives a very well-known speech where he talks about December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. So this generation rises up to the challenge. They were very surprised by the attack. Normally I get to share a really cool story with y'all when we're together about a Pearl Harbor survivor that I got to meet and hear their story. So I want to share that with you when we're actually face to face at some point. So don't forget to ask me about that next year in US history. We'll talk more about that. So anyway, thank you for listening to my intro here as we head into the last section of this chapter. Just know that the last couple of chapters 23 and 24, every year I always wrap up and have students teach the class those chapters. It's kind of a fun way to end the year this year, since we're not together and we can't do that exactly. I'm kind of thinking of a creative way to have you experience those chapters yourself. So more details to come, but let's dive into the Allied advances and kind of get this thing wrapped up. So let's get to our slides for today. And I'm on page 506. So Allied advances, chapter 22, section 4 of your notes. And this is the last time, by the way, that you really need to take notes in this format. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so from North Africa to Italy. So General Montgomery was sent over to basically defeat the German General Rommel. We left off talking about him in our last video, and they fight a pretty major battle at El Alamein. And General Eisenhower from the US, remember the US is now involved, lands in Sicily and basically decides to bring the war to Italy's doorstep and experiences some successes there in Italy. Mussolini was forced to resign and basically is put in prison here. So Italy surrendered unconditionally in September of 1943. Hundreds of thousands of troops of German descent continued to fight in Italy until the Germans eventually surrendered at the end of the war. But Mussolini met a pretty violent end. German troops rescued him from prison and basically established him as kind of this puppet ruler in German-controlled areas of Italy. But as the Axis is collapsing, Mussolini and his mistress and some friends attempt to escape to Switzerland, but Italian partisans basically captured them and shoot Mussolini and his mistress and take their bodies to Milan and hang them, and it's just really kind of graphic. Some of you use this as one of your on this day in history events not too long ago, so I read about that numerous times. All right, let's keep moving here. So the Allies have a series of conferences. In January 43, Churchill and Roosevelt meet at Casablanca, basically kind of making their plans of how do we want this to end. And they come up with this basically goal of having the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. That is what they want. That is how they know they will have been victorious. Okay. Later, the big three, so Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, those three get together for a summit at Tehran. They have some pretty differing opinions on how to go about this, how to end the war, but they agreed to basically invading France and forcing the Germans out. So, pardon me, I've been talking an awful lot today, doing videos, did a Zoom with my seniors earlier, so don't think I'm used to talking quite this much. All right, so what is this invasion going to look like to push the Germans out of France? It has a nickname or a code name, Operation Overlord. General Dwight D. Eisenhower is the Supreme Allied Commander, he and his leaders are responsible for planning this invasion. So they set the date for June 6, 1944. And this invasion involves 10,000 planes, 5,000 ships, 4,000 landing craft, over 1 million men, and tons of supplies. And they even tried to deceive the Germans into thinking that the time and place of the invasion is going to be different. They actually build fake military installations in southeastern England, trying to confuse the Germans. They have pretended tanks that look real to the aircraft that are flying over. They send false messages that they allow the Germans to intercept. So anyway, they're really trying to keep D-Day under wraps so that the Germans don't know what's coming. And they're pretty successful. It's a pretty horrific day. There are lots of losses, but they achieve what they were hoping for. Okay? They land hundreds and hundreds of craft with men that storm the beaches going after the Germans. They also have paratroopers that they drop in behind the German lines so that they can kind of sandwich the Germans in between. There's a little map that you can see the different groups involved, with the US, Canadians, and the British coming across at the different parts of the beaches there. All right, we need to talk just a little bit about the war in the Pacific. We haven't talked at all about that. So remember that Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor December of 1941, and so the US not only sends troops over to Europe, but they need to go do something about Japan. So the US fights a series of naval battles. You've probably heard of the Battle of Midway. There was a movie not too long ago about that. Some of you have probably seen. And so they are fighting out in the Pacific. Okay, so Coral Sea and Midway, pretty major battles. And then because of their victories there, they begin a series of island hopping maneuvers where they basically come in and capture islands in the Pacific and slowly work their way toward Japan. In 1945, they capture Iwo Jima and Okinawa, so they're getting closer and closer to the islands of Japan. And these places are going to provide an air base where they can now launch off of and go after mainland Japan. Okay, so not the best map in the world, but there are other maps out there online where you can kind of see how they work their way closer and closer to Japan there. So eventually the decision is made to put an end to the war. President Roosevelt passes away. He had been in office for a very long time, just starting his 4th term, which I know sounds weird because most presidents serve 2 terms, but we'll talk about that in US history anyway. We have a new guy in office, Harry Truman, and he has to make the decision, does he keep pushing toward Japan, or does he choose to use atomic bombs and bring the war to an end in a different way? And that is what he chooses to do. And so Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the 2 cities that are targeted, and roughly 70,000 people. What does your book say here? On August 6, 1945, the bomb was dropped, wiped out 4.7 square miles of the city, and killed roughly 70,000 people. Many others were injured. When Truman announced this plan, basically he offers to Japan a chance to surrender, and Japan does not. And so he realizes that the war against Japan would end quickly by doing this. So kind of a tough decision on his part, but at that point, that's what he chose to do. So there's a little bit more to this chapter about trying to create peace after the war, spending time talking about the United Nations and what that looks like. So let's go ahead and stop sharing the slides. Hope you guys are finding these videos somewhat helpful. I try to follow along with the book just to keep you on track. So hang in there. The end of the year is getting closer. June is not all that far away anymore. So hope you guys are having a good day, and I'll catch you later. Bye.